to making the cost of an item. And I think you guys have to come to terms with that as agriculture producers. How much are you going to, price an item for? It's interesting, when we were selling produce at the farmers market here in Abingdon, it was very interesting because they actually have rules in place stating that you have to price items similarly to your competitors, which I think is kind of an interesting way to approach it. They're trying to make it to where no one has a competitive edge. Of course, if no one has the same product that you have, then of course you control that price. And also in the seasonality of it as well. For instance, tomatoes, if you buy them in the supermarket, they're going to fluctuate through the seasons, right? They generally do, but maybe within the cent range. However, on the farmer's market, on the more local level, they fluctuate more like on the dollar range. For instance, at our market, there would always be a competition for the first person to get tomatoes to the market. And if you could get them there in May, usually you would have a competitive edge because you could control a higher price. No one else had tomatoes at that time. Later on, though, as everyone brought tomatoes to the market, supply and demand occurs, and the supply increases, the demand might decrease, and therefore the price decreases. And you don't get as much money on it. So you have to kind of find how to get that competitive edge. Later on in the season, we found that people would, the people that went for the early end would be running out of tomatoes, and then those people that were in kind of the later end would start selling them for higher prices just because of supply and demand. So that's something that you have to watch out for. And of course, especially with commodified crops, it's really closely governed by the market. And you can only sell it at that particular price that the market will pay. So it really depends on what your end consumer is and who's buying the products from you. So did anybody have anything really interesting they found out they wanted to share from the lab? Anybody? Well, after we get all the labs in, we'll talk about that a little bit more, and I'll share some of the things that I found that were interesting in your all's labs. But so far, from what I've looked at, it looks like everyone followed directions well and did a good job on that. So most of these will be very straightforward. Just follow the directions, and you'll get an A. You'll get full credit for the work that you did. As far as the quiz goes, we kind of covered that information. I'll be posting that today, and we'll give everybody through Monday to complete that. I think that should give enough time for the online students to catch up there, and then we'll discuss it next, probably on Monday, given that everyone completes that in that time frame. Well, again, for the first one, we'll give a little bit of leeway on that. It'll be short and sweet, about 10 questions, 10 points apiece. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at Chapter 2. If you haven't already, you should be reading Chapter 2, and we'll cover a few highlights on that, and then we'll do a little bit more in-depth review on Monday for Chapter 2. So what is Chapter 2 all about, you all? Anybody crack the book on that? Well, it's one of my favorite topics, actually. As I mentioned on Monday, my undergraduate was in a program that was looking at agroecology, and that's agriculture and ecology, kind of the combined field of the two. So we're going to be talking about that today as well as Monday. Again, take a look at the PowerPoint that is associated. You can find that on the Blackboard site under information and lecture notes. And we'll be trying to post the remaining chapters soon, as soon as we get access to them from the publisher. So we're on chapter 2. I'm going to switch to this PowerPoint, and we'll talk about, try to get through it. So I'm going to kind of breeze through a lot of these slides. So follow along, but really pay attention to what I say that is different than what is listed on the slides, because you will have access to those slides, of course. Let me go into screen share mode. All right, everybody see that?
Yep.
All right, so chapter 2, terrestrial ecosystems and their relationships to cultivating plants. The second slide here, of course, goes over the key learning concepts. And of course, here on slide 3, let me make this full screen here. Talk about how terrestrial ecosystems depend on that wonderful process that really all life on Earth depends on. What's the P word, you all?
Photosynthesis.
Yeah, photosynthesis. The ability for plants to capture energy from the sun. And it's more complex than that, of course, but well, you guys, we'll look at that a little bit later on in a little bit more detail, exactly how photosynthesis works. It's pretty complex. It's a complex process, but basically all life on Earth depends on it. All agriculture depends on photosynthesis, whether you're in the livestock industry or in plant production. Of course, as we talked about on Monday, climate determines the kind of plants that you can grow and the rate at which they grow. And the natural ecosystems tend to be more complex than crop ecosystems. And they note here that the more a crop ecosystem differs from the natural ecosystem, the more difficult it is to sustain. And there are kind of a couple of camps on this. There's kind of probably the majority of agriculture producers feel that we might actually be able to do better than nature. But as you'll see here, in terms of NPP, net primary productivity, we really don't. So there is another camp of kind of sustainable agriculturists out there that think that we should try to be kind of emulating nature. So let's take a look at what an ecosystem is. Basically, any ecosystem is comprised of all of the living and non-living components that are found in any environment. So what are some non-living components, you all?
Rocks.
Sure, the geology, rocks. What else? And what do those rocks become?
Minerals.
Yeah, they basically become soil over time. So the actual natural rock that is in place is going to create the soil that is in place. So it really drives what plants can grow there, and thus what animals and other organisms can survive. What else is non-living components of the ecosystem?
The water.
Yeah, water. Keep them going, y'all. Come on.
Dead animals.
Animals are, well, dead animals, sure. Yeah, they become, that's kind of an interesting thing to look at, because they do eventually become part of the soil. And even though it's non-living, it's really kind of also living at the same time, because they are being decomposed by living things. Whether it's soil microbia or fungi. So all the non-living components, of course, climate is a major component of that as well. Of course, we talked a little bit on Monday about the ecosystem services, and one of those big ones right here, plant pollination, occurring between plants and animals. Also, seed dispersal is a big process that animals are often responsible for. Many of these processes, we really don't see. They occur either underground in the soil or all around us. And it's hard to kind of make tangible relationships in ecology, but they're there. And basically, ecology is everywhere. It doesn't disappear when we grow, houseplants, or when we're doing production in a greenhouse. We still actually have what I consider an agro-ecosystem. So pay attention to that word, agro-ecosystem. They don't really use that in the book, but it's basically looking at our agriculture and all of the living and non-living components that are part of our agriculture. So we'll talk about also about how microflora and fauna are also important in crop ecosystems. We don't often see them again, but if you take a closer look, they are there. Many of them are microscopic, and many of them can be beneficial, or some of them can also be more on the pest level and actually cause harm to our production systems. They talk about excluding macrofauna and non-crop macroflora from what they consider cultivated ecosystems. What I'm saying is an agro-ecosystem. However, I would say we don't want to exclude the larger birds and mammals or the non-crop flora. Why is that? Why would I say that we don't want to exclude that? What are those things often? What do they tend to be? The larger birds and mammals and the larger plants that exist in these agroecosystems, what do they tend to be? So I think of an example. We talked about it a little bit the other day, but like deer, for instance. They're often a pest, right? So when we look at that, they're talking about excluding them. Yeah, we try to exclude them in terms because they're pests often. But really, I think you have to consider them in the picture of the agro-ecosystem as well, which they call here a cultivated ecosystem. And notice here that they say in our cultivated ecosystems that nutrients are necessary to promote crop growth and chemicals are needed to suppress disease. And something I would ask you all is what do we do before we were able to actually purchase chemicals or actually purchase nutrients? Our agriculture was totally different, right? Today, we often rely on purchased inputs. In the past, before the Industrial Revolution, basically all of those inputs came from, the region. They still do in many cases, especially if you want to be cost effective. But we import them from other places now, whereas originally a lot of these resources were managed on the farm. Looking at ecosystem components, talk about how all of these different interactions in natural and crop ecosystems occur and how they're different. And what happens when we have two plants that basically need the same resources? What's the C word there on the slide?
Competition.
Yeah, competition. And basically there's this whole idea in ecology of competitive exclusion. And that basically says that no two organisms that require the same resources can occupy basically the same niche, the same spot in an ecosystem, competing for the same resources. One will always outcompete the other. So when we look at that in our crop systems, we're looking at things like weeds versus our cultivated crops. And something I wanted to add here, talking about the ecosystem components, looking at the difference between monocultures and polycultures. You guys know what I talk about when I say a monoculture?
One singular.
Yeah, one singular crop over an entire area. And often when we practice cropland agriculture, the commodified crops especially, that's what we're doing. We have monocultures, one crop over, in some cases, an entire farm. So we're really just, it's kind of a simplified version of agriculture. However, there are many examples of polycultures in modern agriculture too. Can anybody think of one example? How about any type of livestock production? Does your livestock just eat one plant? Yeah, maybe if you're operating a feedlot, in that case, you know, you're feeding them just grain, and that might just be corn. But in any, you know, natural like rangeland, you're gonna have multiple species of grasses, right? And also legumes in there. So there's a whole mosaic. Those are all polycultures because there's many species involved in that agriculture. So also, as they state in the slide here, usually a single species cannot utilize all resources or the whole of any resource in the environment. And on that last slide, they were looking at that resource as like nitrogen, for instance. Nitrogen use efficiency in plants is at about, or especially crop plants, is about 50%. So where does the rest of that go? Often it runs off. Nitrogen is one of the most mobile nutrients that we deal with, and it actually creates kind of issues in other forms of, or other ecosystems when it does leave the agroecosystem. So one thing that we need to do as land managers is try to figure out how we can kind of keep these resources in place longer. Everybody notice the word there, the N word, niche. Niches exist when resources partition so that different portions are accessible to certain species. This is all about, in ecology, what an organism occupies. So the role of an organism in an ecosystem is its niche. Can anybody give me an example of a niche?
Frog in a swamp.
Sure, yeah, and to be a little bit more detailed on that, you know, the frog eats insects in, you know, a pond or a swampy area, and the types of insects or resources that it consumes are kind of what its niche is, and the habitat that it lives in, where it lays its eggs, where it feeds from. All of that kind of goes into an organism's niche in an ecosystem. And as they put here, to coexist, species must occupy different niches. And that can actually be fairly simple too. I mean, it might not look like they're occupying the same niche, or it might look like they are occupying the same niche, but they're competing for different resources. And we see that in some cases in polycultures. For instance, the Native Americans grew corn, beans, and squash together. You guys have heard of that before? The three sisters. And so when they did that, they had kind of three different niches. And people still do that today in many cases. You grow your corn because it grows upright and it needs, you know, a lot of nitrogen. The beans are legumes, so they actually need less nitrogen, and they might even supply a little bit, and they actually climb up the corn. Squash, on the other hand, competes for different nutrients, some of the same nutrients, but it's in a different area of the soil, kind of occupying a different root zone, and also providing a ground cover, to be a living mulch to keep out weeds, and also hold in some soil moisture. So the three of them are kind of competing for the same nutrients in certain situations, but they're also kind of occupying different niches. So in that case, they're not necessarily competitively excluding each other. So in a healthy natural ecosystem, every available niche tends to be filled, and resources, they say fully exploited, but not necessarily completely exhausted. So what happens when you have multiple organisms competing over the same resources? One of them gets excluded. And so if our weeds grow taller than our plants, they're competing for light as a resource. And in that case, they are diminishing that resource and causing our crops to be excluded. I'm sure everybody's dealt with that. I'm dealing with it at my house right now with my garden. Crop ecosystems, or agroecosystems as I prefer to call them, often have one or a few species that do not exploit all of the resources of the environment. And therefore, niches tend to be available for other plants. Weeds, right? So we have to look at that. And we have to look at how we could grow crops in order to have them better compete with weeds. What is one way that we do that in a commercial, like produce production? Does anybody that grow tomatoes, for instance, anybody use a plastic mulch? You guys seen that before? Often they lay down plastic to control the weeds, and on a lot of really productive agroecosystems, they actually use that. So as a way to exclude weeds. So weed control strategies are extremely important in plant production. We're going to look at some other kind of forms of ecological relationships. In general, there are kind of a few different types of ecological relationships. We have mutualism, where multiple organisms benefit each other. We have parasitism, where one organism benefits off of the other. And then there's commensalism, where one may benefit and the other is not harmed. So we're trying to actually emulate some of those in our agroecosystems as well. So when we call predation or parasitism to plants from other organisms, that is known as herbivory. So that's basically pests eating your crops usually, or feeding off of them. Of course, we can also look at more than what they kind of list here, more than just the mollusks and arthropods, mammals and birds, but also microorganisms too. Diseases do the same thing. One big issue with agroecology is that our crop ecosystems are more vulnerable to competition in many different ways because we have altered the ecosystem ourselves. For instance, when we go in and plow and till the soil, we are actually, we're making an ideal environment for our crops, but we're also making an ideal environment for weeds. In altering the ecosystem, we're also often making an ideal environment for pests too, especially in greenhouse production. Anybody ever seen aphids in a greenhouse? I'm sure if you've been to any greenhouse, you've probably seen aphids. And those aphids are a huge issue because they can transmit disease. They feed on crops, they cause diseases. They are, a benefit of an altered ecosystem. You really don't see aphids nearly as much outdoors in more extensive agroecosystems. So it becomes necessary for us to use outside inputs in order to control these other influences, basically. going to kind of skip over the parasitism and let you guys kind of look at that a little later on. So again, I'm going to kind of skip through some of these slides for time's sake. But just know that parasitism really is basically looking at organisms feeding on our crops to a negative association there for our crops. On this slide, we're looking at kind of a more mutualistic relationship where we have mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza is basically a soil fungi, and now modern science is actually looking at trying to work with ecology rather than work against it. So in many cases, people are actually adding mycorrhiza back to soil as kind of a more of a biological kind of fertilizer in a way. It's not really a fertilizer, but it allows the uptake of minerals to be much more efficient. More ecosystems components here, and looking at symbiosis here, like lichens, for instance, living on tree trunks can be an issue in orchards especially, but often is more commensalistic. They don't really do that much damage. Anyone's heard of rhizobium? Rhizobium is basically a bacteria that lives in the roots of nitrogen-fixing plants, allowing them to take nitrogen out of the air and actually fix it within the plant. And basically all legumes undergo this process. But you have to have the rhizobium first. So a lot of farmers are now inoculating their legumes with rhizobium bacteria that you can purchase. Already mentioned commensalism there. Here they're talking about saprophytes, which are organisms that basically feed on organic matter and work basically to help it to be available to plants and other crops. This slide looks at some of those ecological relationships and how these things are filled. And I definitely want to pay attention to this whole idea here of the trophic levels. And they just number them, 1, 2, and 3 here. But generally, what we're looking at are, going from producers. That's the kind of the primary producers are the first level. The second level being herbivores that eat the plants, and then the third level being the predators that eat the herbivores. And that's kind of the traditional sort of food chain kind of look. But really, we're looking at it more today as a complex web of relationships and interrelationships, where it doesn't necessarily just go one direction. The energy kind of goes throughout. So here we're talking about biomes, and biomes are collections of ecosystems across a large area of land. What is the biome that we are in? Kind of related to the next slide here, related to our climate. What is our climate, you all? T word? We live in a temperate climate, right? We have 4 seasons. And that really is over this entire biome of really eastern temperate forests. Very similar from, basically all the way at least to the Mississippi River, and often, far west of it, all the way to the Rocky Mountains. It's pretty similar climate. We'll see differences of it in temperature as we go south, and also in some cases as we go west. But that's related to other things as well, such as topography, another non-living component. We talked a little bit earlier about soils and how they are produced from rock, the parent material of the rock. And they really kind of, along with the climate, determine what can grow. Plants, of course, are the primary producers and the key components of any ecosystem. Different soils developing different biomes basically create the suitability for different crops. However, we do alter those soils in order to make them effective for multiple crops. We talk about temperature, it's primarily influenced by latitude, but that's on the climate scale. On the microclimate scale, we look at things like topography and how that affects the temperature. So be thinking both on the climatic scale as well as the microclimate. You know, our climates are very similar from here in Southwest Virginia to you guys in Southside, but actually they're relatively similar. I mean, we might be in different hardiness zones, but we have fairly similar climates, even though we have different soils. This slide talks about different biomes, and they're looking at how basically air moves and winds move throughout the planet, and kind of the different climates that it affects as a result. And you can kind of see here, you know, in our area, a lot of our moisture tends to come from the Gulf of Mexico, although we can have some coming from the Atlantic as well, and we can have some coming from more northern climates. We actually live in an interesting, you know, part being in the mid-Atlantic. Virginia, we have potential for multiple kind of air masses to come together and create weather, especially here in the Appalachian Mountains. As we know, at the equator, temperatures are fairly stable. They say high all year, but I mean, not necessarily always high. I mean, they are tropical, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always high temperatures. It just means that they're relatively stable and they don't experience frost, basically, which again governs our growing season. I'm going to kind of skip over some of this stuff with the rainforests, talking about the light levels here. I'm going to move over here to the next slide. Again, this is talking more about the winds and how they move over the planet, carrying moisture, and also, in this case, in the next slide, moving moisture away. So what do you guys notice about these areas in orange on this slide? What kind of climate occurs here? Hot and dry. Yeah, these are all, if you look, they're all deserts, very arid areas. These are areas where moisture basically moves away and basically creates deserts. And some of that, you know, unless you actually travel through there, I mean, a lot of people kind of think about the Pacific Northwest as being extremely humid, being temperate rainforests, but that's really just that Pacific Northwest, the area that is basically next to the ocean. The Cascade and Sierra Nevada mountain ranges, if you go west of those mountain ranges, or I'm sorry, east of those mountain ranges, it's all desert basically. However, these areas are extremely productive in terms of agriculture. We got the Central Valley of California, extremely productive. That's where we get most of our produce that we find in stores. Also, you know, kind of central Oregon and Washington and eastern Oregon, Washington, extremely productive areas. And that's partially because they do still have water. They don't have natural rainfall as much, but they have tons of water in terms of groundwater. And basically that's coming from moisture leaving the mountain ranges and flowing into these desert areas. For instance, the Columbia River in eastern Washington and Oregon, extremely productive area of agriculture. And all of this, kind of goes to say that the places where we produce most of our crops are the places where those crops grow best. And you probably saw that in the lab as well, that, often these areas where a lot of these crops come from are due to that being just a perfect climate to produce those things. This talks a little bit about deciduous forests, our climate. Of course, we know quite a bit about that already, so I'm going to kind of skip over that and skip over a little bit about the deciduous stuff. They talk about grasslands and savannas here, and about how there are different abiotic things that kind of control these ecosystems, such as fire is a big thing in savannas, as well as both temperate and other forests. Fire is still an important part of them. Talking about grasslands and former grasslands, which North America, we're talking about, basically the Midwest, one of the most agricultural productive regions in the world, basically was all grassland at one point, and that creates very rich soil. Of course, when you plow it, as I mentioned before, you are releasing carbon, and that's one of the big things that we look at in ecology, is that we're looking at the movement of carbon. So net primary productivity is looking at biomass and basically looking at biomass as stores of carbon. Here we're talking about arid lands, which are already dry, but then can become desert completely. But however, when we add the proper limiting crop resources, they can become very agriculturally productive. We still have a lot of people that are living in, desert areas. As they say here, 250 million or so people in the world. That was in 2011, which makes it very vulnerable to issues such as climate change. Again, they're talking about the convergence of winds here and how that affects climate in these slides. And we're looking in this green area. This is what they call a taiga, where basically that's almost like evergreens, coniferous trees that grow in the taiga areas. And the plant diversity is much lower. Generally, as a function, we have highest plant diversity around the equator and the tropics. And as we go north, it's reduced. Less species of plants, basically. As we see down here, they have the red circle. In that area, we really don't have much of that vegetation. There's not much taiga there because it's also extremely dry. Not only is it just cold, but it's also dry. Like Antarctica, for instance, is technically, in terms of rainfall, also a desert. Talk about the taiga here. Now, agriculture is still conducted, although on a smaller scale, in the taiga, in those areas. There's some haymaking. There's a small farm. I mean, people have to eat there too that live there, but we have very few people that do live in those areas. North of the taiga is the tundra, and really there's not much that grows on the tundra because tundra remains frozen. The soils are frozen, right? Almost all biomes have been influenced by human activity, and many of them have actually been close to destroyed, such as grasslands. There are very few actual native intact prairies because they've mostly been turned over to agriculture because it's arable land. There is wanted to mention real quick an organization in the Midwest called the Land Institute, and they're doing some interesting studies and research there in agriculture and trying to create perennial grain crops. They're basically taking those basically the ancestors of the crops like wheat and barley, rye, sorghum, and they're trying to crossbreed them in order to make them perennial crops. Because of course perennials actually help to maintain the soil. So that's an organization that is in a way kind of reverting and looking at ecology as a way to try to emulate it and trying to bring that back into our agriculture. You guys that are interested in forestry, basically all of the temperate forests in Eastern North America have been completely logged at one point. And much of that has reverted back to forest land now, although much of it has been turned into farmland as well. Much of tropical rainforest has been cleared and is still being cleared for agriculture purposes. However, it's a much bigger issue there because tropical rainforests are basically dependent upon ecology, this complex web of interactions that keep it going. So rainforest deforestation is really looked at as an ecological catastrophe. They're finding that when they do log rainforests and then turn it into agricultural land, that it quickly becomes non-productive because the soils are so thin. Wetlands, of course, very productive ecosystems, they tend to act as buffers. In many places, we actually drain wetlands also for crop production, which then leaves other areas more susceptible to drought because this is a place, it's a buffer, a place to store soil moisture, excuse me. And as I mentioned, ecological buffer zones where a lot of animal life comes from. Kind of skip over some of this. We're quickly running out of time, so I'm going to kind of hit some highlights here. Again, plant productivity, we're looking at that as the amount of CO2 taken up from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and then plants actually fixing that into plant tissues known as biomass. And they don't really talk about, or they don't mention the term NPP, net primary productivity, but I do want you guys to note that that is basically a measure of biomass that is looked at through basically the sequestration of carbon dioxide. And here we have basically a little graph that's looking at the productivity of different ecosystems based on the biomass that is fixed per year. Notice that tropical forests and tropical savannas, of course, are the most productive. And then temperate forests, also productive, but not nearly as productive, considering that they are only photosynthetically active for part of the year. Notice here that cropland is actually quite a bit less productive. I mean, it's less than half as productive as tropical forests. However, even with the technology that we've created and kind of increasing our productivity, we're still not as productive as many natural ecosystems on their own. Of course, urban areas, very little productivity. And I think that we're going to see these figures change as we continue to develop more technology. Wanted to mention real briefly about carbon fixation, and basically we are, as human beings, we're exploiting different pools of carbon. We're surviving off of them. Soil carbon in terms of soil productivity, in terms of plowing the prairie in the Midwest, that is actually using carbon that was sequestered before in the grasslands for thousands of years. Crop productivity is not usually looked at as the same as net primary productivity because we're not looking at the entire biomass produced. We're just looking at one part of the plant that is harvested. Make note of that. And as they say here, the difference in annual and perennial crops, annual crops in terms of primary productivity are actually kind of wasteful because a lot of that fixed carbon is removed at harvest and must be fixed again the following year, whereas the perennial crops continue to allocate part of that fixed carbon into root mass in the soil. And that goes back to that whole Land Institute thing that I was talking about and why they're trying to do more perennial agriculture. If you're in the livestock industry, you're already conducting perennial agriculture in many cases. Finally, a little bit about succession here, and that's the change of ecosystems over time and how eventually it will reach a climax community. And I think that's kind of what the Land Institute is looking at. They're trying to create their own type of climax community that is more productive in terms of crops that we actually eat. Succession occurs in any type of ecosystem, especially agroecosystems. When we plow the soil, first thing that moves in are pioneer species, right? Which we also know as weed. If we don't do something about them, those pioneer species will take over, and especially in disturbed soils. All right, you all. Well, it continues to talk about succession, so look over that PowerPoint in a little bit more detail, but we came pretty close to getting through it there. We're going to brush up and review a little bit on that on Monday, but definitely read the chapter, look through the PowerPoint, make a few notes of your own, and take the quiz for chapter 1. And I'll put that up today. It should be available to you guys after you're out of your animal science class. All right, well, sorry to, again, try to jam so much in such little time, but it's about time for your next class, so I'm going to let you guys go.
Okay.
If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me.
Bye.